Hey guys, this is Alex from Ignite Prep. Welcome to the Reading Comprehension course. I'm really excited to have all of you join me on the journey towards a 99th percentile reading comprehension score. So what we're going to be covering in this lesson are the basics of reading comprehension. What's being tested, the section directions, the types of passages, the passage topics, where passages come from, and then all of these are going to come together and become our base for when we go into our next lesson, which is going to be the general RC strategy. So let's begin with a little introduction into what the reading comprehension section is. You have 4 passages and 35 minutes to complete them. Within that time frame, we're going to have 26 to 28 questions in total, which gives us 8 minutes and 45 seconds to get through each passage and the questions. Now, it's not a great idea to go through and expect yourself to finish each passage in 8 minutes and 45 seconds. There are easier passages, harder passages, easier questions, harder questions, and then we have those special questions that are kind of easy but are also time dumps and super tedious. So we want to be flexible and aware of how much time we're spending on each question and each passage. So, how do we partition our time out, you might ask? Well, a lot of people get confused about whether to spend more time going through their passage or more time going through their questions. Now, I've been tutoring for a while, and all this time I've tried all different ways to space out my time on the reading comprehension section. And I can tell you without a doubt that you should always read your passage first. Spend more time going through and dissecting your passage than you do going through and doing the questions. So now that we know the basics of the reading comprehension section, let's take a look at what's actually being tested and why reading comprehension makes up 1/3 of your LSAT score. Each section of the LSAT is testing some facet of critical reasoning. You have logical reasoning testing all these different components of logic, like assumptions and validity and conditional logic, all coming together at once. But you have these short little stimuli, so you don't have to rely too much on remembering elements from your stimulus. You can just quickly refer back. With reading comprehension, we have much larger stimuli. We have these big passages, and so we do need to change our approach. We need to be able to recall details quickly while also reading for the bigger picture. So RC is pretty heavily testing your short-term memory. But if you're someone whose short-term memory is not great, don't worry, I have a strategy for you. Note-taking and annotations are going to be the savior of your RC score as you build out passage maps. And then, last but not least, we have logic games, which is testing your ability to visually organize information presented to you. But in this lesson, we're focusing on reading comprehension, and so you should go into your studying of this section with a good idea of why you're doing this, because we're not just doing this for an LSAT score. Reading comprehension obviously covers critical reading, but it also helps you build other essential skills, not only to be a good law school student, but to be a good lawyer. It's testing your ability to take a load of probably poorly written information, digest it, and then make judgments based off of it. Now, we definitely have a lot of overlap in our studying for reading comprehension and logical reasoning. A lot of the topics we're covering in LR are going to help with RC and vice versa. Likewise, our work in logic games will help us annotate better in reading comprehension. But I do want to make a note of the fact that the ability to critically read is the fundamental base of any good LSAT score. It's great to have a firm grasp of logic and timing and note-taking, but without critical reading, you will never reach your true potential on this test. So please remember, this ability to read and digest the passages as they're presented to you is going to help you on every section of your test. It's going to make you a better critical reader who is more skeptical of things and not just accepting things in your answer choices or as they're presented to you in your passage. You're going to have to look to learn for proof when you're presented with an argument in your passage. You're going to have to learn to partition out viewpoints to certain people and look for what opinions belong to the author and what opinions belong to the other side of the argument. Or maybe you have a passage that doesn't have an argument at all, and you just have a set of viewpoints all being juxtaposed next to each other. Now, these are all things that we have seen in logical reasoning. The difference here, and in reading comprehension, is going to be the size and scope of it. Reading comprehension requires you to take a step back and see the bigger picture. Now, in logical reasoning, we have a little tiny stimuli, maybe 2 or 3 sentences. You don't really have to work too hard to remember information, and if you don't remember it, it's not going to be a huge time dump to go back and reread your stimulus. But in reading comprehension, you don't have that luxury. You can't afford to get through an entire passage and realize that there are huge chunks of it that you're missing the comprehension of. Now, I know we've all been there, and it's super frustrating, but what's even more frustrating is when you have a good comprehension of your passage and you go on to your questions and you're told to refer back to specific portions or specific lines of your passage. Sometimes they give you a line number for those, other times they don't. And so it's important to keep track of our information through annotations so we can be as efficient as possible as we're referring back to our passage. And so in this case, the reading comprehension section becomes similar to logic games, because you're going to need to almost diagram out your passage in order to find out what was said and how it was said, where it was said, and be able to do all of that in roughly 8 minutes. And so now to talk about timing. As we begin our RC journey, we're going to need more time than the 8 minutes to get a firm grasp of what it is we're reading. So just like how we started logical reasoning, we are going to start reading comprehension untimed. Now eventually, we're going to need to fold back and wean ourselves back into time, because unless you have accommodations, you are locked down to that 35-minute limit. But that's not a bad thing, because soon you're going to be a law school student. And a little bit after that, you're going to be a lawyer. And lawyers are required in law school to read huge amounts of information and condense it into a way that's not only easy for them to understand, but also easy for a judge to understand and a jury to understand and for clients and professors to understand. And so I would even make the argument that even though reading comprehension is probably the scariest or the most hated section by most LSAT students, it is probably the most directly applicable to your experience as both a lawyer and a law student. So now that you understand what reading comprehension is looking to test, hopefully you have a little bit more motivation to do reading comprehension to the best of your ability. Let's get into our section directions. Alright, so each reading comprehension section begins with the same directions, and just like we broke it down in the logical reasoning section, we're going to do the same thing here. So let's read it together. Each set of questions in this section is based on a single passage or a pair of passages. The questions are to be answered on the basis of what is stated or implied in the passage or pair of passages. For some questions, more than one of the choices could conceivably answer the question. However, you are to choose the best answer, that is, the response that most accurately and completely answers the question, and blacken the corresponding space on your answer sheet. So obviously, this first sentence gives us a basic breakdown of what we have. We have 3 single passages, and then we have 1 set of dual or comparative passages. For single passages, we have 1 long passage with 5 to 8 questions. And for dual passages, we have 2 shorter passages with 5 to 8 questions. Don't worry about this for now. We're going to go really in depth into both types later on. But really where the instructions become important is when we get to the second sentence, which says, the questions are to be answered on the basis of what is stated or implied in the passage or pair of passages. So, things are either stated or implied, and that gives us a rough idea of what the reading comprehension section is looking for us to do. And this is really important because it gives us the ability to break questions down into 2 types. We have explicit questions and we have implicit questions. However, I feel like this may be misleading for a lot of people because it makes it seem like you have pretty heavy reading comprehension inference section, and you really don't. For every single question, with enough time, you should be able to actually go back to your passage and highlight a line or a set of lines that is backing up the answer choices that you're picking. So what this means is that we should be really wary of taking things too far in our passage. I see students do it a lot. It's really common. They go and they read something and they put words in the passage's mouth. That's going to be a huge weight dragging your score down. We want to learn to take the LSAT at face value. You guys can go and read a lot of different styling material telling you to do the exact opposite. And that's great if you want to keep yourself at 160. But if you want to strive to be a better reader in the RC section and the LSAT in general, what you want to be doing is taking the word choice at face value and looking to see what effect that specific word choice or sentence structure has on what it is you are reading. So what can we do to improve our reading comprehension? Learn the difference between explicit and inference. Learn to take the test at face value. Learn to make inferences and focus on word choice. Now that's a nice segue into the next sentence of the directions, where it says that more than one of the answer choices could conceivably answer the question. That's kind of true. However, there is something definitively wrong with 4 of the answer choices. We saw this in the logical reasoning section directions, and we talked about it there, and it's no different here. There is only one correct answer choice for every RC section. Just like how we can find something to support our correct answer choice, you should be able to go into the passages and find things that contradict the other 4. And you know what? Our incorrect answer choices can take several different forms in reading comprehension. We have answer choices that are direct opposite things of what the author says. We have answer choices that distort what the author is saying and expand or narrow our scope. We have answer choices that are just ridiculous and have nothing to do with what's being talked about. And then we have answer choices that attribute a viewpoint to the wrong person, such as giving the author someone else's viewpoint. So just because a viewpoint or an idea is mentioned in the passage does not mean that it is the correct answer. I think that's a pretty definite point of confusion with a lot of students, is that they recognize familiar aspects in their answer choices. But you have to remember, your job is not just to recognize the things that you're reading. Your job is to correctly apply it based on the goal your question stem gives you. So for example, you can have secondary ideas presented to you in a passage, but that does not make them the main idea if you have a main idea question. I think reading comprehension most of all across the 3 section types on the LSAT is the easiest one to find evidence for because of the nature of the longer passages. Whereas in your stimuli and logical reasoning, you have the ability to really comprehend whatever idea that is they're really giving you. The scope of reading comprehension passages is way more defined than a logical reasoning stimuli because of the fact that the passages are longer than the stimuli. They have more space to really develop an idea and to develop the scope, so there's less guesswork involved. So with that being said, you have to know more later on throughout the whole passage. You have to know that you are not bringing in additional information into your passage. Scope in reading comprehension, just like in logical reasoning, is a deal breaker for a good score. And if you are the kind of person who is taking that and reapplying it to yourself and inserting yourself back in the passage, you will not do well because they will actively punish you in your answer choices. So we have to be really careful to not stray from the ideas and the viewpoints in the evidence presented to you. Now that's usually not so much of a problem because the LSAT now picks pretty mundane topics for the reading comprehension passages. And so most of the time you won't find passages that you have some kind of personal connection to, where you're going to be able to insert outside information into it. However, as human beings, we're going to form an opinion of what it is we are reading. And you want to be really, really careful with that in the reading comprehension section because your opinions do not have any basis on what the author themselves is saying. You are not being tested on your ability to form a good argument based on what you read. You are being tested on your ability to analyze the argument presented to you. Now there's one last thing I wanted to talk about regarding the directions before we move on, and that is this idea that you have to choose the best answer. So I just kind of went on this rant where there's only one correct answer choice. But the test makers here are kind of telling you, hey guys, you should read all of the answer choices before you move on. And I would say that's a pretty good piece of advice, because a lot of the times we read an answer choice and then we get locked into this false sense of security, thinking, hey, I recognize that. I remember that from my passage. And then you want to pick that one. Reading all of the answer choices is kind of like a safety net for you to make sure that you haven't been led into a trap. And so as a general rule of thumb, make sure that you read all of the answer choices. Very rarely will I just pick one answer choice in RC that I like and move on and not read the others. I have to be really confident with what I just read to do that. And since you're in the beginning of your reading comprehension journey, you're really not at that point. You would be kind of doing yourself a disservice by not reading all of the answer choices for 2 reasons. The first one is going to be that reading all the answer choices saves you from falling for traps. We just talked about that. The second one is that we have to remember what is our goal here in learning and reading and practicing RC. It's to make sure that we don't miss questions on test day. And reading through the 4 wrong answer choices and telling yourself why they are wrong, it's just going to be more practice for you to identify wrong answer choices on test day and make sure you don't pick them. So to sum up our section directions, what we are trying to do in reading comprehension is number one, we want to highlight. We want to take notes. We want to break down what the author is saying and get it into normal, everyday language. But we also want to set up our comprehension in a way that we can quickly remember what we read, because it's not feasible to expect yourself to go back to the passage and find something word for every question. You'll very quickly run out of time with that approach, and so you do need some type of short-term memory when you're walking through the reading comprehension section. You do need to at least be able to remember where things were in order to identify things not stated at all in your passage. So now that we've gone through all of that, let's take a look at the types of passages that we're going to be presented with in our reading comprehension section. So as discussed in the section directions chapter of this video, you do have two passage types. We have single passages and we have dual or comparative passages. Now, a lot of LSAT study material is going to use older practice tests so that you don't burn through your newer practice tests. But dual passages only came out after the June 2007 test, which is a common diagnostic test given to most people. If we're taking something like PT25 or PT15 and using it to study reading comprehension, you should know that there's not going to be comparative passages there. So of our 4 passages, we have 3 long passages. These 3 long passages are going to be the single passages, and they're going to have 5 to 8 questions. Then we have 1 set of dual passages. These dual passages obviously are shorter because the overall length of the comparative passages combined is the same as the 1 single long passage. These comparative passages also have 5 to 8 questions, and I will say, usually the comparative passages are not that bad. It's very rare to see a 5-star comparative passage, because kind of the trick with them is that you have to weave together the 2 viewpoints being presented to you and see how they relate. Are they in contradiction? Is one a principle and the other is the application? Do we just have 2 passages just discussing a set of facts? Usually there is some kind of overarching theme or something they have in common, but you could have different relationships between the 2 comparative passages. We're obviously going to have our own separate lessons on comparative passages, but the really tricky thing with them is figuring out what the relationship is between the 2 of them, which is not always so simple. For example, you could have passages which are in contradiction with each other, with one person saying something is good while the other person saying something is bad. Well, a lot of times in these disagreement passages, there actually are points of common ground that are hidden in there. Do not assume that just because they're disagreeing in general, they must disagree on everything. So throughout our course, we're going to spend a lot of time looking at the single long passages, just because they're 75% of the section. But just because the comparative passages have a little bit of extra flavor attached to them, does not mean that a different type of reading is involved. Everything we learn in this course is crucial for reading comprehension, like how to read, how to highlight, how to take notes. The types of things to pay attention to with regards to the single long passages are still 100% applicable to your comparative passages. So because of that, we're going to study our comparative passages at the end, once we have a good grasp of how to read and what types of things to look for. And then you guys can go in and add the extra element that's required to ace the comparative passages. So now, let's take a look at the topics that our passages can talk about. Broadly speaking, passages come from 4 different disciplines: humanities, law, science, and art. I think most people break down reading comprehension this way, which is not bad when you're just starting out. But I will say you do want to limit your view of reading comprehension to this method for your earlier approach to reading comprehension. And that's because knowing the passage topic really doesn't tell you that much. There are some pretty broad things we can learn, though, looking at the topic. For example, usually humanities and law passages are typically more abstract, and that makes them a little bit harder, a little bit more time-consuming. These abstract humanities and law passages typically deal with more inference questions, more author's opinion questions, and less on the explicit fact-finding questions that you see in the science and art passages. With science passages, the kind of hallmark feature of them is that you have this technical jargon that usually freaks a lot of people out. But you should know that the buck usually stops there with the jargon as far as the science passages are concerned. And if you were able to look past that technical vocabulary, which is scary vocabulary, you'll be in good shape to go in and conquer the science passage questions. So, It's good to have all of these things in mind when you're approaching reading comprehension, but you should know that inserting yourself too much can really hurt you as you're becoming a better RC test taker. Therefore, we should be looking more at the passages objectively. The subject matter really does not matter. It does not matter if you're reading a humanities passage about Leonardo da Vinci or a science passage about brain surgery. Your goal is the same. Your goal is to go through and see what is being said. Define what is not being said, right? We want to draw that line and have a distinction between what the author stated and then what it seems like he's trying to get you to think, but is not really explicitly stated. We want to be thinking, what is the main idea the author is trying to present, and why is he writing this? What supplementary or contradictory viewpoints does he bring up? And then we want to take those things and put it all together into a strong general comprehension of the passage. And then we go in and ace our questions based off of that. Personally, I feel like it's better to break passages down into what they are trying to accomplish. You have some passages that present you with a problem in the first paragraph, and then the author spends the rest of the passage discussing either a solution or various different solutions to that problem. You have other passages where they give you a famous person in history and explain to you why that person is important. And from that, it is possible to break the LSAT reading comprehension passages down into roughly 7 different goal types. Now, in the beginning of our studying, we're going to put those different types off to the side until we are better readers. But eventually, that is how you should be looking at your passages. Because if you can figure out what the passage is trying to do, that gives you a very strong framework from which to build your comprehension and organization of the passage. And so for that reason, when we take a look at passages as being either humanities or law, we're doing that for now. It's an okay way to organize them. But in the long run, we're really not going to pay that much credence to that because there's no strategy just for humanities passages, and it doesn't do anything to further your comprehension of what you're reading by just categorizing into broad subject matter. And so with that, let's go and take a look at where these passages are actually coming from and how they're made to get you a better idea of what the reading comprehension section is trying to get out of you. What I find pretty interesting is that most passages on the LSAT actually aren't written by the test makers. Instead, passages actually come from original sources. And you can check me on this by going to the back of any of your PT PDFs. Or if you have the practice test books, if you look at the very last page of any released or disclosed practice test, you will see the source for the reading comprehension passages there. I've listed here some sources from the most recent PTs. So the LSAT takes original source material and it processes it. They then modify it to fit the needs of the test. Now I find this really interesting because if you go back to the original source of the reading comprehension passage and you study it, you'll see what differences the test makers made to turn it into a passage. You can kind of see what their needs were, what changes they had to make to fit their needs. And that's actually something that I did back when I was an LSAT student. As someone's trying to get a 180 on this test, I looked at a couple of tests and I pulled their source material to track what changes they made. And what I found was that sometimes you had whole books or whole articles condensed into 3 or 4 or 5 paragraphs as just kind of a broad synopsis of what was stated. And then we also had other passages where very little modifications was made to the source material. One of the most common things I noticed was the addition of supplementary viewpoints, which told me that the LSAT is really big on viewpoints, and that's become kind of a hallmark feature of how I approach the RC section. I'm always paying attention to viewpoints, to opinions, to what was stated and whose opinion it was, because that's going to be one of the more common traps on the LSAT, getting you to attribute the viewpoint to someone who it doesn't belong to. And I saw that over and over again as I compared the source material to the modified LSAT passage and saw what it was the test writers were looking for in their source material. The other thing that I found that was pretty interesting was that a lot of the time the source material was actually a little bit more convoluted than the passage itself. The test writers might have actually kind of dumbed it down for you guys to be able to read through it. So they take original source material, package it up, and deliver it to you in a lovely little RC passage for your enjoyment. So to explain that point, let me tell you some of the sources the LSAT passages come from. The most easy of which is scientific periodicals, right? So like a medical journal or something like that, is a pretty common source for the science passages on the LSAT. Now, obviously, most people taking the LSAT are not doctors or medical students or even pre-medical students, which means there is a huge disconnect between who that original source article was written for and who's actually reading it now. Now, that's a very, very important point, and I want you guys to really digest that and think about it, because one of the biggest pitfalls I see when I'm looking at people studying RC is that they're trying to understand every passage like it was written for them or written with them in mind. No article or medical periodical was ever written with LSAT test takers in mind. You guys don't have, for the most part, the contextual or educational background to truly understand and grasp every topic or every idea or every piece of evidence that is being presented to you in your passage. And I know that it's frustrating when you're trying to actively read a passage, but you feel like you don't have a firm grasp of the subject material. And for that reason, a lot of the science passages just kind of get dumbed down by the test writers for you, so that you still have a nice mix between the technical jargon and that vocabulary, which is going to slow you down, but then also you kind of just have the plain, straightforward English for you to be able to get a grasp of what is really being stated. And so with the science articles, it is a really great idea to look at them and try to remain objective. What I mean by that is to limit yourself to understanding what was stated versus what was not stated. When you're stuck, try and talk it out with yourself. Try to keep in mind that the subject matter really doesn't matter, and just ask yourself, what points are the author trying to get across to me? For example, right now I'm recording this course at kind of the tail end of the COVID pandemic. Probably, I would say, most of you don't understand how COVID vaccine works. So let's say I get a doctor or a biochemist here to sit through with you and explain to you the nuances and the details of how vaccines work from a doctor's standpoint. Probably most of you would be able to follow along. Hopefully the doctor is good at his job and can kind of express himself in a way that everybody can understand. But, we could understand him, but what we could not do is leave that conversation and use what we learned to teach a class on mRNA vaccines. What could we do then? Well, we could go home and we could talk to our family in a casual setting about what the doctor said and discuss it. And we could answer questions based on what we heard from him. But say somebody asked you about how the flu vaccine worked. What would you say? Would you kind of try and give an answer even though you don't really know? What would be correct as far as the LSAT is concerned is to say, he did not talk about that. It was out of the scope of our conversation. And that's exactly what these RC passages are trying to get you to do. These source material, these passages, came from, they were written for people who have a pretty thorough educational background that support their comprehension of what they're reading. For the most part, in RC passages, you lack that educational or contextual background, and that's why you're limited to simply what was stated versus what was not stated in defining your scope. And so to kind of sum up what it is I'm saying, always read harder passages with 3 ideas in mind. Remember that the passage was not written for you. Keep it in the context of being written for someone else and modified to fit the standardized kind of test-looking passage that we get, to see how well you can be critical of what it is you are reading. When you're losing grip on your passage, try to focus on the big picture elements like main idea and purpose and viewpoints. And 3, try not to memorize little details. Focus on organizing them so you can refer back to them later. So as we are practicing and studying the reading comprehension section, keep in mind that you had an original source that was modified to fit the needs of the LSAT. One of the most common things they do is to squish down a whole chapter, like 500 pages of text, into 4 paragraphs. And what we do to summarize is we take the big picture and expand a little bit on it without going crazy into details. And so as you're reading passages, these big picture ideas should be at the forefront of your mind, because those were the things that were at the forefront of the test maker's mind when they made the passage. And so with that, we're now going to end this video off. We should have a pretty firm base of what the reading comprehension section is and what it's trying to get us to do. So now go on and start and put it into a strategy, and for that I will see you guys in the next video.